Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. There are fast-moving developments this hour related to the impeachment inquiry into President Trump. House Democrats have issued a subpoena for his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. They are seeking documents related to the president's now infamous phone call with the president of Ukraine. He is the latest member of the president's inner circle to face this request. The House Intelligence Committee has already issued a subpoena for Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. The Wall Street Journal tonight is reporting that Pompeo was on the July 25th call. CBS News has not confirmed that report. And within the last hour, the New York Times is out with reporting that says the president recently asked the Prime Minister of Australia for help in the Justice Department's efforts to investigate how the Mueller probe started. The fast-moving reports come as White House officials spend the day meeting over how they plan to manage the fallout, while the president tries to discredit the whistleblower whose complaint served as the catalyst for the impeachment inquiry. Today, the president says he wants to, quote, meet his accuser. CBS News Chief Congressional Correspondent Nancy Cordes spoke to Senate Intelligence Vice Chairman Mark Warner, who says that's not going to happen.
I think this is a clear example of reprisal, and I think the potential threat to this whistleblower's life is a realistic concern. And if I were the whistleblower or anyone else the whistleblower talked to, I think it would be a rational conclusion to say you may be in jeopardy.
And Nancy Cordes joins us now from Capitol Hill. We are also joined by Politico senior reporter Darren Samuelsohn and Wall Street Journal Capitol Hill reporter Siobhan Hughes. Welcome to you all. Nancy, I'd like to start with you. Before we get to your conversation with Senator Mark Warner, let's begin with this most recent subpoena. What do Democrats hope to learn from Rudy Giuliani? How likely is it that he actually testifies?
Well, they aren't setting a date for a hearing just yet. Instead, what they are asking him for is a mountain of documents. Let's just say that Rudy Giuliani is going to be very busy in the Home Office collecting all of these documents if he does intend to cooperate, because Democrats who lead 3 different committees are asking for basically 4 pages worth of documents. I'll hold up the list for you just so you can kind of get a sense. They want to know everything about any communications he had for the past 2.5 years about Hunter Biden, about Ukraine, about Paul Manafort. They want any notes he has about a meeting at the White House on May 23rd, any information he has about meetings or telephone communications between President Trump and the president of Ukraine. It goes on and on and on, and the leaders of these committees say that they want this information by October 15th. Separately, we do know that there has been a lot of talk among Democratic leaders about whether and when they should have Giuliani come in and speak to them, and in which format, because there have been some concerns that perhaps a hearing might not be the right setting, that Giuliani tends to be quite animated, that it would give the entire impeachment process, which they want to have this very somber tone, more of a circus-like atmosphere instead. So they've been discussing trying to bring him in for an interview behind closed doors instead. But at least in this communication that they've sent to him today, there is no mention of a meeting with him at this time. They just want to get him busy collecting and handing over documents by October 15th.
So, Nancy, who else are you hearing might be subpoenaed either for documents or to come talk to the committee in person in the coming days?
Well, Democrats issued a subpoena to the Secretary of State at the end of last week, calling on him to hand over documents by the end of this week. They had actually asked for those documents several weeks ago, but they got no response, so they took the next step of issuing a subpoena. And then beyond that, they do have depositions scheduled with 5 different current or former State Department officials over the next 2 weeks. However, they have not been able to confirm to us that those officials have actually agreed to come in for depositions on the dates that they've been scheduled. And so it's really unclear right now. They've got a couple scheduled at the end of this week, for instance, and we don't know at this point whether that was ambitious on the part of the House Intelligence Committee, and they have some indication that these current and former officials will show up, or whether this was meant to pressure the State Department into actually communicating with the committee to give those individuals the authorization to come forward and actually sit for these depositions.
And Darren, Rudy Giuliani's connections to Ukraine extend beyond just this most recent phone call. Walk us through his involvement with the country.
Sure. Rudy Giuliani has ties to the Ukraine that do go back quite a bit. He has clients through his foreign consulting business, ties to some of the mayors and politicians in the Ukraine. These are all documents that the House Democrats have just requested, some of the subcategories of materials that the Democrats want answers to deal with Rudy's connections to a whole host of people in the Ukraine, also his outreach to Ukrainian lawmakers, his attempts through sub-channels at the State Department as well to get to Ukrainian officials. Rudy has been pushing this Ukrainian story going back in the media here in the United States, going back to about the end of April as the Mueller investigation was wrapping up. He was certainly talking to reporters, trying to get them interested in writing about the Joe Biden connection to the Ukraine. And, you know, he's been on the television circuit for the last many months trying to pump this up. I think he would at one point have argued that it was successful in doing that, but it has certainly come back to bite him as we see today.
Well, Nancy, how is the White House responding to all of this?
Well, the White House is basically saying you've got to ask Rudy Giuliani. They say they don't know whether Giuliani actually has any important documents to turn over, but that that if we have any interest in what kinds of documents he does have, that we should ask him. So obviously putting a little distance between the White House and Giuliani, as we see, as Darren just mentioned, some finger pointing going in various directions here between Giuliani, the State Department, and the White House.
And Siobhan, your paper, the Wall Street Journal, is reporting that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was on that July 25th call. How much more pressure does that put on Secretary Pompeo, who we know already faces a subpoena?
That's enormous pressure for Mike Pompeo. Up until this point, Democrats had only really had questions about what type of involvement he may have had. A whistleblower complaint pointed to State Department officials seeming to be in the know, but no one was really clear on how high up the chain of command this went. If Mike Pompeo was on that call, that puts him squarely in the center of this, and it's only going to increase the pressure that Democrats are placing on him.
And all weekend, Siobhan, we heard essentially the same talking points from members of the GOP over the impeachment inquiry, mainly that the whistleblower was not on the call, that the Inspector General did not read the transcript before acting on the whistleblower complaint, and the White House released the transcript, indication the president did nothing, they say, that would be impeachable. So do Republicans have any other strategies to defend the president? How does the Republican Party plan to continue here politically?
It's largely a messaging campaign focused on that point, the secondhand nature of the allegations, focused on a talking point from the White House that the Democrats can't beat me in 2020, so they're going to try to impeach me, and also focused on attacking the credibility of a lot of the players. Look for the Republicans to go hard, for example, after Adam Schiff and other people.
And Nancy, in a phone call with her caucus last night, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said this inquiry is a somber one and one that is not about the president or partisanship. How is that message resonating with Democrats?
Well, I think most Democrats agree with that messaging. They don't want anyone doing a victory lap or, saying that this is a slam dunk or in any way making this appear more political than Republicans are already arguing that it is. And of course, it's impossible to divorce politics from all of this, even no matter how much Nancy Pelosi says that politics have nothing to do with this. But certainly they want to look like they are, they're being very methodical, they're being very deliberate. She even said in a separate conversation that the House should act like a jury and that it should look at exculpatory evidence in addition to damning evidence. So she's trying to make the case that she is being pulled into this unwillingly and that she's taking it very seriously. And as she has said many times, she's being very prayerful about it. On the other hand, she also mentioned in that very same phone call, Elaine, that the polls related to impeachment have begun to swing the Democrats' way. And she made that point very clearly because she has said all along that there would be no point in pursuing impeachment if the American public wasn't on the Democrats' side. Well, new polling by CBS News and other outlets has showed a pretty significant jump in the number of Americans who now support, at the very least, an impeachment inquiry, if not outright articles of impeachment. And so Democrats see that movement as an indication that they are on the right track.
And in your conversation, Nancy, with Senator Warner, you asked him about former Vice President Biden. How willing is the Democratic Party to perhaps also look into any potential wrongdoing by the Democratic frontrunner?
Well, they say they're open to it, but that so far, in their view, this is pretty cut and dried, that Ukrainian prosecutors have said that they were never looking into Hunter Biden, that Hunter Biden himself was never under any scrutiny, and that therefore the notion that Vice President Biden tried to have a prosecutor fired so that he would stop looking into Hunter Biden, they argue is simply made up out of whole cloth. Warner said in our conversation that he'd certainly be open to looking at any evidence that came his way, but they don't believe that that part of this story merits further scrutiny. They believe that it is a talking point that has been trumped up by the president, by Rudy Giuliani, to make one of his chief political rivals look bad.
Darren, we are finally hearing more from someone who's been somewhat quiet this past week, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He says he would take up impeachment proceedings if a resolution came over from the House, but you write those rules are not explicitly laid out in the Constitution. Explain that.
Sure. So the House obviously is where the articles of impeachment are written. The Constitution says that the Senate is supposed to try those impeachment articles, and it'll be like a jury with 100 senators deciding whether Donald Trump would be convicted or not. But nowhere in the Constitution does it say that there must be a trial by the Senate. And Mitch McConnell has certainly shown with the Merrick Garland nomination in the Supreme Court that President Obama put forward that if he wanted to, Mitch McConnell does have the power with the majority to try and, table that trial and not even let, it happen at any substantive level. There would have to be some kind of a vote to change the Senate rules. Mitch McConnell gave an interview, I believe it was this morning, with CNBC, talking about those Senate rules, talking about how a 2/3 majority would need to pass in order to set aside a trial. But if he wanted to change the rules and actually just table this or not have a substantive debate, I believe it was with a majority is what he would need. He would obviously need some of his more vulnerable Senate Republicans to go along with him on the idea of tabling a trial. But we certainly saw in 2016 Mitch McConnell capable of doing that, saying that, look, in an election year, maybe the voters should be the people to decide on President Donald Trump's fate. We're hearing that talking point from Republicans. If and when we get to the issue of a Senate trial, I think that's going to be the main question for Mitch McConnell, is whether he would change the rules and avoid a trial altogether, or does he do some kind of very quick trial, an abbreviated trial? Or does he let the whole thing go and air out all those grievances and let the Senate, go where it will? And I think that's a question that ultimately, as you were talking about before, public opinion polls. Right now they're showing, Americans overall maybe supporting impeachment, but Mitch McConnell will be watching very closely to see how Republicans feel about that specifically. Donald Trump's approval numbers among Republicans have stayed very steady throughout his entire presidency, around 90%. As long as that number is 90%, I think Mitch McConnell would feel pretty safe and have some cover in making such a decision to table a trial. But if that number starts to trend downward, if Republicans start to speak up and say, maybe we don't want Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, maybe it's time to, as they say, cut off the head of the king, that would be where Mitch McConnell maybe does allow a trial to go forward. And if he senses that there's 20 senators that are willing to join all 47 Democrats in convicting Donald Trump, then we could see a potential game over, but a long way between here and there.
Yeah, I mean, Darren, I know you don't have a crystal ball, none of us does, but would you expect, given what you just laid out and where public opinion is and how Republicans are feeling about this right now, would you expect the majority leader and members of his party to support tabling potential impeachment proceedings?
It's really hard to tell. You got to watch Susan Collins. You have to watch Tom Tillis, Cory Gardner. Where do those senators who have a very tough reelection next year, where do they come down on this question? And I think they're going to hold off and reserve their judgment until the House actually acts, until the House actually puts the facts and its impeachment articles on the table. Once they know what those are, then I think the senators will start to come out. But right now, the senators are probably in a pretty safe, bunkered down position. It's going to be hard to dodge questions from reporters all the time, but I think that's where they're going to stay until we get more definitive answers from the House Democrats, and whether any House Republicans, also very important, whether any House Republicans come on board with the Democrats. If you start to see sizable numbers of sizable numbers of Republicans in the House joining the Democrats, that'll put some more pressure on those Senate Republicans as well.
So, Siobhan, as we mentioned at the top of the show, there have been some fast-moving developments just today alone. What are you keeping an eye on for the rest of the week?
What I'm keeping an eye on for the rest of the week are the two State Department officials who are supposed to come in and give depositions, the former ambassador and the former special advisor to Ukraine, Kurt Volker. Now, those are behind closed doors, but I'm going to be very interested to see if we can report what comes out of those, what directions they might point in.
Nancy, what about you?
Siobhan, I'll be watching to see if those depositions happen, if those officials actually do show up, and if so, what they have to say about, Rudy Giuliani's actions in Ukraine and their interactions with him, and how much we can actually get from the House Intelligence Committee from them. Also watching to see what happens in these ongoing negotiations with lawyers for the whistleblower to secure his or her testimony. This is not a quick process. Typically, they have to get this whistleblower's lawyers special security passes, security clearance, so that they can accompany him into closed session with House Intelligence Committees to discuss matters that may or may not be classified. That is a process that can sometimes take weeks, but he or she is seen as so central to the investigation, both in the House and now this sort of amorphous, undefined investigation that is also taking place in the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee. So how quickly can they get that whistleblower in to talk to lawmakers, and what leads do they glean from that conversation? That's what I'll be watching for as well.
All right, Nancy Cortez, Darren Samuelsohn, and Siobhan Hughes. Happy Monday, everyone. Thank you very much.